And hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are delighted to have Columbus, Ohio author Kristen Lepionka with us today to talk to us about her Roxanne Weary mystery series. And Kristen joins us as an author from Columbus, and we're going to be talking about her first book and also her second book, her first book, The Last Place You Look, and her upcoming title, What You Want to See. And Kristen is the author of the Roxanne Weary mystery series, starting with The Last Place You Look. She grew up mostly in a public library and could often be found in the adult mystery section well before she was out of middle school. Her writing has been selected for Shotgun Honey, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, Grift, and Black Elephant. She lives in Columbus, Ohio with her partner and two cats, and she's represented by Jill Marshall of the Marsall Lyon Literary Agency. And we're delighted to have Kristen with us today to talk to us about her outstanding mystery series. So Kristen, welcome to Chapters. Great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about, we got a little sense of you from your bio there that you spent a lot of time growing up in the adult mystery section. When did you decide you wanted to become a writer, and how did that process start?
Well, I kind of think I wanted to be a writer as soon as I realized that someone had to write the books that I was reading, and that seemed like a really cool job. As early as 6 or 7, I was always writing weird little stories in my notebooks or, on my dad's word processor that he brought home from work in the good old early 90s days of typing. And I always just loved telling stories and just being able to create worlds and writing characters as a way of kind of explaining the world and what we, experience as going through life. A lot of the time writers take our feelings and we figure them all out through writing. So. Very good, excellent.
So did you gravitate early on towards sort of the adult mystery, or did you have another genre you liked and kind of stumbled into a mystery? How did that work?
So the first book that I ever remember absolutely loving was a middle grade mystery called Sam the Cat Detective by Linda Stewart, and it's fantastic, and everybody should read it if you like mysteries. Even though it's about a cat, it's actually a really well constructed mystery. But I loved cats, and so I picked up this book. And I just loved the idea of there being this detective who is investigating people and talking to different people to figure out the truth, and that just really struck a chord with me. And I kind of started looking into other mysteries. There are, quite a few middle grade and young adult mysteries, but then eventually it was the adult mystery section for me, and I was this weird kid, 12 years old, reading Ed McBain. People probably didn't know what to do with me.
Very good, excellent, very good. Well, you've got an outstanding mystery series that you've started with a great character named Roxanne Weary, who I can't wait to talk to you a little bit about today. The first book is The Last Place You Look. Mm-hmm. So, when I read Roxanne and I read her, the first thing I thought of, here's a wonderfully complex character. Here is somebody who is so many different things, and at one time you see her functioning in this domain, at another time you see her functioning in this domain. Tell us a little bit about Roxanne and what it is about her that makes her kind of complex.
Okay, well, I think that what I really started with when I was creating her was I wanted to write a heroine who gets to save the day while also being a mess. A lot of the time in mystery fiction, there are plenty of really complex male characters, but women are either they're tough badasses or they're vulnerable. They're never both. They don't get to be a badass who's also vulnerable sometimes. And so I really wanted to play with that and write someone who is tough but is also kind of falling apart and has a lot of complexities in her personal life. She struggles with drinking too much whiskey. She's recently lost her father, so she's full of all kinds of feelings about that, not because she had a good relationship with him, but because she had a terrible relationship with him, and his death has really thrown her. She just has kind of a messy personal life, and she doesn't really know what to do with herself. And then the book sort of starts with this case falling into her lap that it's impossible for her to turn down, and it helps her through that very rough patch of not knowing how to function, really.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about how that book begins, as you mentioned, it starts sort of with this cold case or an allegedly cold/closed case that kind of falls into her lap. But one of the interesting things is at the beginning of the story, we think that Roxanne sees the woman that she's looking for. She's sort of driving through the street there, and she notices the silhouette or the back of the character. But then it turns out that that's not exactly who she's looking for. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in that closed case, and without giving too much away, I guess,
Right.
who is that silhouette that she thinks she sees early on?
So the case at the center of the book is there's a man named Brad Stockton who is currently on death row for murdering his girlfriend's parents 15 years ago. And on the night of this crime, his girlfriend, Sarah, disappeared. And the murder weapon was found in Brad's car. It seems like an open and shut case, but Brad claims he didn't do it. And no one knows what happened to Sarah. And it's just kind of this messy thing that happened in this little, polite suburb where there was incontrovertible evidence that Brad was guilty, yet he said he wasn't. So there he is on death row. He's been there for 15 years. And he's facing his execution date coming up in a couple weeks. And all of a sudden, his sister thinks that she's run into Sarah just on the street at a gas station. And after 15 years of no one being able to find this woman, it seems like, well, maybe that's very, convenient timing for Brad's sister to think, oh, there she is all of a sudden. But it prompts her to want to investigate further, which is when she brings in Roxanne. And Roxanne kind of thinks it's pretty unlikely that that's actually who you saw. And it turns out, actually, I won't say what it turns out, as that would be a spoiler. But it's much more complicated than just, figure out who that was, and then it's all solved. Like, it really opens up a real can of worms in this town.
Yeah. And one of the interesting relationships, Roxanne's got so many interesting relationships. I love the relationships that she has with one of her brothers and her mother, and there's a great dinner scene early in the book where we really see the family dynamics there. But she also has a great relationship with a detective named Tom. So tell us a little bit about their relationship, and I read Tom to be kind of a surrogate father. He kind of fills the void that maybe her deceased father had once filled. But tell us a little bit about him.
Right, so Roxanne's dad, he was a police officer, and he was shot and killed in the line of duty about 9 months before the book starts, and this detective, Tom, was her father's partner on the police force. And so ever since Roxanne's dad died, they've been sort of doing their best to help each other through this time, mostly just with, sex. And, I mean, that's a valid means of comforting someone. But he sort of, he sees Roxanne differently than really anyone else does, because he sees her the way that her dad saw her, and she had this really combative relationship with him, but he thought the world of her, which she didn't even really know. So that's sort of something that Tom brings to the relationship, and she almost doesn't understand how it's possible that someone that she had such a tough relationship with was actually very proud of her. And so they have this kind of uneasy dynamic about that. But they are also really important to each other, because no one else knew Frank Weary the way Roxanne and the way Tom did.
And I know that you can tell he genuinely cares about her, because there's moments where, she says some things to him and tries to push him away and kind of, pushes him out of her apartment. But he never really loses his patience with her, never really loses perspective with how much he cares about her, which I thought was a really nice part of their relationship, that he could take whatever Roxanne dished out, but he never lost his patience, never lost the fact that he still really cared about her.
Right.
So I really enjoyed that. I love first sentences in stories, and I loved your first sentence. Matt said you find things for a living, the woman said on the phone. And we find out that's sort of how Roxanne is contacted and how she takes her cases. So tell us a little bit about who Matt is, and who is it that she's talking to in that first sentence. Who's Roxanne talking to?
So Roxanne's talking to Brad's sister, so the sister of the man on death row, and she's also the person who believes that she saw Sarah, the missing woman, outside this gas station. And Matt is one of Roxanne's brothers. She has two brothers, Andrew and Matt. And Matt is her oldest brother. Roxanne is the middle brother. And Roxanne's the youngest. Did I say Andrew is the middle brother? What did I just say? Matt is the oldest. Andrew is the middle. Roxanne is the youngest. And she has a great relationship with Andrew. They're very similar in a lot of ways. They're pretty close, and she doesn't really get along with Matt very well. He's a recovering addict and kind of sanctimonious about sobriety at times, which she just cannot deal with at this point in her life. She finds it very tedious when he starts in with his, you never have to have another drink again. And she's just like, this is not the time to be discussing that. And he's just, one of those people. He's her brother. She loves him, but they just don't get along really well. But she definitely gets along better with her other brother, Andrew.
Very good. One of the other things I really like about your book is the setting. The setting is there's a strong sense of place really created everywhere you go. And there's scenes in a park where Roxanne thinks that she's maybe found a body, and then there's scenes in her apartment, and scenes at her mother's house, and scenes driving through this rural suburb of Columbus. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you, what makes Columbus and sort of that area of the state of Ohio really a great place to set a mystery? Because you take us kind of to the urban parts of it and mm-hmm. the suburban parts of it and the rural parts of it. Well, right. What makes that part sort of so interesting, in your opinion, to set a story or set a mystery?
Well, I think it's exactly what you just said. It's kind of like the apex of all of those things. We have like the big city, and then we have the country that's not very far away, and we have these sort of wealthier suburbs, and it's just a lot of different types of people kind of all on top of each other. And so Roxanne lives in Columbus. All of the action in the book takes place in a suburb that is fictional, called Belmont. And I decided to create my own suburb because you read it, so a lot of stuff goes down there. I did not want to malign the good name of any of our lovely suburbs. So I decided I would just create a new one. It's kind of based on a couple. It's just kind of a combination. But it just creates a place like Columbus is interesting because we have, it's the largest city in Ohio. It's a big city. It's in the top 20 in the country as far as size. But then you get even 10 or 15 miles outside of the city, you're in the middle of nowhere. And so there's like tension that pops up between city people and country people. There's tension that pops up between rich people and poor people. It's just a combination of intersections that makes for a lot of interesting storytelling possibilities.
And I know there's moments too in the story where the sheriff of Belmont mm-hmm. takes offense to Roxanne showing up. She's considered very much an outsider that's kind of trickling yes. into their community and sticking her nose, as he says, in places that it doesn't belong. So mm-hmm. very much that urban versus rural
right.
Connection there, or confrontation. Let me ask you about your writing process. When did you get the idea to write Roxanne Weary and start this series? And what was your process like in terms of drafting and revision and all of that? How did that work for you?
Well, I've always wanted to write like a series like this. And I tried my hand with a couple other different series that went nowhere and weren't any good and are buried forever on my computer. But then I sort of got the idea for this character because in the fall of 2014, I was listening to the podcast Serial, and which is about a man who's been in prison for 15 years-ish for murdering his girlfriend. It's a very different case, but it has this idea of a person who has been in jail for so long for something that he claims he didn't do. And I was just really thinking about how if you were to be put in jail for something you didn't do, your initial instinct, of course, would be to like fight like hell, get out of jail, and eventually like you've fought all the fights there are to fight, and continuing to fight only makes your time probably harder because like it's pointless. And so like it's one thing to be incarcerated for a year, but like 15 years, that is an incredible amount of time, especially, for a young man to be in jail for his entire adult life. And it got me thinking about what that would do to a person. And as a result, when Roxanne interacts with him, she sort of gets the impression that he is like not that interested in having her help or not that interested in proving his own innocence. And she finds him kind of difficult and doesn't really know like what to think of him. And that's not so much a commentary on whether or not he is guilty or innocent, but really just kind of a coping mechanism for how he's like been able to survive that long in jail. And so that was sort of where I started with the idea for the case. And the idea for the character really started with her name, actually. I knew I wanted to use the name Roxanne, and I wasn't sure what last name was right for her. And I when I come up with character names, I make a lot of lists and cross things out, and I like sort of collect names, and I hear someone's name and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, I'll put it down. And nothing was working. And then I was watching television and I saw the name of an actor on the screen. His name was Jake Weary. And I was like, that's it. That's her name. And it really just came together after that, like who she was as a person. I feel like her name holds a lot of sort of context for her. Like, I think the name Roxanne sounds kind of tough, but it's also a feminine name, and the name Weary is fairly expressive, I think, as far as her worldview, ditto for her father. So once I had her name, I knew that I wanted to create this complicated person. I knew I wanted to give her a huge sort of trauma in her recent past with her father's death, and this really complicated family situation. And I wish I had a better answer for how that all came out in my process. It just kind of like magically came out. If I knew how, I would be able to replicate it every time. Unfortunately, I don't. It's always kind of a mystery how these things happen. But once I had all those pieces, it really came together pretty fast. And as far as books go, it's kind of a baby. So I started writing it in the fall of 2014, and I finished it in the spring of 2015, so about 6 months later. And then about 6 months after that, it had sold to my publisher. So it was a very compressed timeline for getting published. And I feel really lucky about that, because it's not always, oh, the best books in the world get published. There are plenty of good books that don't get published. It's also a matter of luck, and I'm definitely aware of that.
Very good. Excellent. And you talked about Roxanne's name. One of my favorite parts of the book is when there's many times when she says Roxanne, only one N.
Yeah.
So it's Roxane, not Roxanne.
Right.
And she reminds people of that several times in the story, which I think is a really nice touch.
And interestingly, people like writing about the book constantly misspell it, which I think is so interesting, because like the spelling is specifically like, it's like a thing in the book, but like it's always misspelled on materials. It's not a big deal, but it's just kind of funny.
So even though Roxanne, the character, says only one N, people still can't get it right. I understand. Yeah. Very good. Tell us a little bit about your next book in this series. The Last Place You Look was your first, and now your latest one, I think, is coming out in May of 2018. Is that right?
Yep, May 1st.
Okay, May 1st of 2018. What You Want to See. So tell us a little bit about what Roxanne is going to get herself into in that second book.
Yes. So What You Want to See opens about 7 months after the end of The Last Place You Look. And without giving too much away, things have sort of settled down a bit for Roxanne. And she takes a case that seems like it's not going to be that interesting. She's hired to find out if a man's fiance is cheating on him. But it turns out to be much, much more than that, because the woman ends up dead, and it turns out she has a ton of secrets. And there's a lot of threads that sort of get tangled around this woman's life.
So will we see Tom? Will he return in this
Tom
book?
will return, yes.
Very good.
Yes.
Excellent. I love it. And also, as before we were talking before we taped today, you just recently signed a contract for 2 more books in the series. So What You Want to See will be the next book, and then we can expect 2 more after that in the Roxanne Weary series. So do you have the plots and the storylines for those next 2 worked out, or are those still kind of to be determined?
I have the plot for the 3rd book, which is currently tentatively called The Stories You Tell. I have that pretty well worked out, and I'm in the process of starting to write that one. The 4th one, I am still deciding between 2 ideas. I'm not sure which one is going to be the winner. Okay. But fortunately, I've got a little bit of time on that. So. Good.
Excellent. Very good. So who are some writers that have influenced you or really inspired you as you've become a writer and started getting published? Who do you look to and say, wow, that work is really, I wish I could write like that, or that person influenced me in creating this character or this person or whatever?
Well, definitely Sue Grafton, author of the Brilliant Alphabet series, who recently passed away at the end of last year. She was really one of the trailblazers in writing a female private investigator. Her series started in the 80s, and it's actually, the books continued to be set in the 80s, which is kind of an interesting thing, but she was really one of the first who wrote a woman doing this job that so often only men were doing in books. So she was definitely one of my big inspirations. I've always loved the Robert B. Parker Spencer series. And then there are some other brilliant crime writers, not so much in the private investigator vein, like Richard Price, Ed McBain, although he did write a couple different series. Tana French is another huge favorite of mine who's writing right now. So really, I've always loved the private investigator style, but mystery in general is just like, that's my jam. I love all of that, all of the different sub-genres.
I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned private investigators, having those characters featured as sort of your protagonist, as opposed to a hard-boiled detective or what is stereotypically known as a regular detective or a homicide investigator, for example. Any advantages that you find as a writer in having a private investigator as opposed to having that sort of law-abiding, sort of cut out of cloth detective that we see sometimes? I'm thinking about Michael Connelly. I'm thinking
Right.
about the ones that I'm thinking about comparing him. With someone like Easy Rollins and Walter Mosley, who is more of a private eye and kind of operates out on. Michael Bosch is who I was trying to think of with Michael Connelly. So kind of comparing them, they're different, and what Rollins can do a few things that that Connelly's character can't do, that Harry Bosch can't do, because Bosch has to follow this code of conduct as a LAPD detective, at least early on in his career. So, what are some advantages to working with a PI as opposed to having that cut in the cloth detective?
Well, it's definitely, there's more like freedom and flexibility to not necessarily do things by a specific established rigid procedure, and also like a PI can sort of bend the rules, and it's like not that big of a deal because it's like in the interest of a good story, so it's okay. Whereas like a cop who bent the rules a lot would have to answer for that. Otherwise, it would be like a really unrealistic story. But it's definitely just like that freedom and that sort of lone wolf element that has a private eye character just sort of doing their own thing, able to sort of take the cases that they choose to take. That's another thing, not being assigned a case, but like Roxanne at any point could walk away from this case and nothing would happen, because she's a private citizen. Like a cop investigating this case would have to see it through no matter what. So I think that sort of, it adds this layer of drama for characters who are struggling with something that they nonetheless are not willing to let go of. Even though she could technically let go of it, she also can't let go of it. Yeah. And I think that makes for some interesting storytelling.
Absolutely, yes, I agree. And I back to Michael Connelly, I don't like Harry Bosch nearly as well now that he's out of the police department as I did when he was in. I mean, I know he's still working and collaborating with some of those people that he worked with in the department, but I liked him much better inside the department. But I agree exactly with what you're saying about PIs. I wanted to ask you a little bit about getting into this genre. If someone in our audience is thinking about going down this road of writing in sort of the mystery suspense thriller genre, any advice you would give them, or anything you would tell them about, before you get started, make sure that you have thought about this or prepared to do this or anything like that?
Sure. So I had written 4 other manuscripts before I wrote this book, and I had tried to find an agent. And I got a lot of feedback that was basically, your writing is great, but you have no story. And I was kind of like, oh, well, that's kind of encouraging, because my writing is great, but also like I don't have a story. And in mystery genre, it's really important that you have a good story. Like if I probably should have picked a different genre. I should have written something else that didn't require a story. But so I had to really learn about how to create a story that has like suspense and tension, and that doesn't really just come naturally. Like even if you've read a million mysteries and watched every mystery movie ever, it doesn't just come naturally. You have to really be calculated about how you insert the suspense. And when I finished the first draft of The Last Place You Look, it was actually quite different than the final version. The plot was the same setup and ultimately the same conclusion, but the middle, it didn't have a tension, like an element that was pulling it all the way through. And as a writer, as an artist, you can kind of think, oh, well, that's the way I want it, that's my story. But like, there's nothing wrong with going in there and saying, no, I need to think about how the reader is going to be feeling about this. And the fact is, if people are busy, and if you give someone a place to put the book down because they're not super engaged in what's going to happen next, they'll put it down and they might not pick it back up. So you really have to keep those threads going and just be really calculated about how you're structuring it, because like it doesn't make you less of an artiste, I promise, if you go in there and are very sort of clinical about suspense and plotting, because it really comes out a lot different when you think in terms of, okay, here's where the tension is ramping up to, here's a slight release in tension, but then this thread is getting more tense, and it's really necessary to keep the tension up throughout, because otherwise, like I said, readers won't feel that need to keep turning the pages. And that's what we really want, is for everyone to just keep reading. And so you gotta deliver the goods and give them a reason to do that.
And red herrings, I think, are important too, aren't they? And kind of where you place those in the story, and how many, and are the red herrings there for misdirection, or are they there to kind of get the character into the next red herring, which is ultimately going to get them to the real answer that they want?
Well, I think that for people who read mysteries, a lot of the time, it's really great for the reader to figure out who did it maybe like a split second before the detective does, because then you can feel smart, but also you don't feel like you figured it out on page 50 and then there's this bumbling detective who has no idea who did it, and you're like reading and you're like, why? I know who did it. And so like you really want to like think about that and make sure you've planted clues for the reader to possibly figure it out without it being too obvious. And it's really important that it all comes together in a way where the conclusion seems inevitable but still unexpected. And the red herrings are huge for that, because we as writers kind of use those to like sort of lead a reader down a path. And it's really great for you put out your clues and the reader is just sort of like following your breadcrumbs, and then something is happening over here, but the reader isn't noticing it because they're following your breadcrumbs over here. And so you have to really just think about what you want the reader to be paying attention to at any given time, and then sort of build things in the background around that.
Excellent. I think it's excellent advice. Thank you very much for sharing that. So, Kristen, in our final moments with you here today, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk about The Last Place You Look or your upcoming book, What You Want to See, where can they get in contact with you, and how can they get in contact with you, and where can they get copies of your books?
Right. So you can get in contact with me on my website, which is KristenLepionka.com. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at KMLWrites. And I love to talk, so feel free to contact me. And books are available everywhere, but definitely support your indie bookstores.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. Excellent advice. Fascinating discussion today with Kristen Lepionka. We've been talking with her today about her outstanding Roxanne Weary mystery series. The first book in that series, The Last Place You Look. The upcoming book coming out in May of 2018 is What You Want to See. And I would encourage anybody who really wants to follow a fascinating, dynamic, but complex female protagonist that we don't see, as you mentioned, in mystery detective fiction very often, to check her out, because she's really, really great, and everything that she gets herself into, both verbally and through her actions, really interesting. Great character, and appreciate you coming on the program to talk about it. A really great discussion. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We also want to take a moment to say thanks to Chris Dargish and the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and inquire about Kristen's books, and also remind you that many of the other author, editor, and publisher interviews we've had here on the program, those places and those folks have their works for sale right here at the bookstore. So come down to Pullman Square and check out Empire Books and News, and they can get any reading taste satisfied that you might have. If you want to stay in contact with the program through social media, we've made a variety of ways available to you through various social media platforms. One of those is our email address, which is right here at the bottom of the screen. It's lp4@zoominternet.net. We do ask your name and town when you are writing to us so that we can keep track of that correspondence. And we also have a chapters page through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube. So if you're a YouTube viewer and user, all you need to do is go to the address right here at the bottom of the screen, click on the chapters tab, and there we have all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And we're also on Facebook. If you'd like to check us out on Facebook, our Facebook address is right here at the bottom of the screen as well. We have more of our recent author, editor, and publisher interviews archived on the Facebook page, but you can interact with viewers of the program, like and give hearts and do all the Facebook emoticons to the episodes that you see. Share those on your page and spread those around on your own social media page, Facebook and other places that you may have available to you on Facebook. We know a lot of you have taken advantage of that through the Facebook page, and we appreciate that so very much. So whether you like email, you like YouTube, you like Facebook, we've made it possible for you to stay in contact with the program through one of those means on social media. And we appreciate all those folks that do reach out to us and do help us share our content and also respond and reflect on the author, editor, and publisher interviews you see archived in those places. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.